Good afternoon. I know I have a very hard time. We only got drinks. And so from that perspective, to basically start the official part of this commemorative moment is difficult. So I'm Marcel Rindisbacher. I'm the faculty director of the Ravi K. Mehrotra Institute for Business Markets and Society at Boston University. And it's a really genuine pleasure to welcome you to this commemoration marking 150 years since the patenting of one of the most consequential inventions in modern history. There is also something especially fitting about gathering here at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. This building has stood since 1814. It housed some of the earliest mechanized textile production in the United States. It is in its bone a monument to the proposition that science, engineering, and commerce can combine to change how human beings live and work. That is precisely the story we are here to reflect on today. At the Mehrotra Institute, we think deeply about institutions that make market economies innovative, dynamic, socially meaningful, and the history of the telephone is, at its core, a story about exactly that. It is not just a story of remarkable invention, it is a story of how scientific discovery became commercially viable, socially transformative, and historically enduring. Breakthroughs of this kind do not happen in isolation. They emerge from an interconnected network of institutions, scientific inquiry supported by public investment and long-term commitment to knowledge, legal frameworks, among them patents and intellectual property, that create incentives to develop and advance new ideas, and business with its capacity to finance, organize, scale, and distribute new technology so that discovery moves from the laboratory into everyday life. The telephone is a powerful example of that interaction. A scientific and technical advance became, through institutional support, legal infrastructure, and business execution, a technology that reshaped communication, commerce, and society. It changed how firms operated, how markets connect, how information traveled, and in a deeper sense, how human beings experience distance itself. That is not a small thing. That is why this anniversary matters. It invites us to reflect not only on the invention itself, but on the broader system that makes innovation possible. Public-supported science, intellectual property infrastructure, entrepreneurial initiative, and the organizational capacity of business to bring new technologies into the world at scale. These questions are not historical curiosities. They are alive today in debates about AI, about pharmaceutical patents, about who benefits from discovery, and who gets left behind. Moments of commemoration, though, should be thoughtful rather than only triumphant. Two things deserve acknowledgement as well. First, Bell expressed views on heredity and human difference that are close to a painful chapter in the history of science. His later thinking was more complex, and we cannot simplify things by just putting etiquettes on people and have simple labels, but does not lessen the name to the harms and implications of those ideas plainly. We also should reflect on socio-cultural circumstances and historical contexts where these things appear. And honest commemoration requires that we acknowledge them without allowing context to blunt moral clarity. Second, transformative discoveries are rarely the work of one person alone. The telephone emerged from scientific advance, experimentation, patent rivalry, and continued refinement across many individuals and institutions. Bell and Boston University have an important place in that story. But the 150th anniversary of Bell's patent is not only a moment to look back, it is also a chance to reflect on questions that remain highly relevant today. How science, politics, and business together shaped innovations that societies produce, diffuse, and sustain. That question is central to the Mehrotra Institute. We examine how business markets and institutions shape innovation and help translate discovery into wider economic and societal change. Few stories illustrate that relationship more clearly than the one we are commemorating this evening. So I hope we begin in a spirit of both appreciation and inquiry. Appreciation for a transformative moment in the history of human invention, and inquiry into the forces, scientific, institutional, commercial, and social that made that transformation possible, and that continue to shape the world the telephone helped bring into being. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm really looking forward to an excellent panel, and I will now turn it over to Jay Zagorsky, who will introduce the panelists and lead you through the first discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcel, and thank you, Crystal May, for organizing this. So my name is Jay Zagorsky, and I'm a professor at Boston University's Questrom School of Business. And Boston University is just an important part of the telephone invention. And when I found this out, I was like, why doesn't Boston University talk about this a little bit more? Alexander Graham Bell, for those of you who didn't know, was a professor at Boston University. And he was making wonderful progress on this new invention to transmit voice over long distances. And his dean was so impressed by the progress, he gave Alexander Graham Bell a one-year paid sabbatical. And during that one-year paid sabbatical, Alexander Graham Bell filed the first of his many patents and provided a working prototype. So I have the honor today of sitting up here on the stage with two very important people, plus in the audience are also some other very important people that I'd like to introduce in a moment. The first person is Sara Grosvenour. Thank you very much, Sara, for being here with us. She is the great-granddaughter of Alexander Graham Bell. She's also the president of the Alexander and Mabel, because wives are just as important as husbands, Mabel Bell Legacy Foundation, as well as being an accomplished journalist in her own right. And she can give us some insights into what Bell was like and what Mabel was like. And this means during the reception, you can talk to a living relative of the famous inventor. Also in the audience today, and I'd like to say, I'd like all of you to stand up, are many members of Thomas Watson's family. If you read Bell's letters, and unfortunately I'm old, but not that old to actually have met the man, he's basically said that Thomas Watson took my ideas and turned it into reality. And without Watson, Bell's ideas, like any great theorist, could not have actually been made practical. So what was one of the famous lines? Watson, I need you. Maybe Watson family, I need you to stand up. For my MBA members, my MBA students out there in the audience, it's always about a team, okay? It's just I, it's always about we. Also here on the stage, I have the honor of sitting here with Sowmyanarayan Sampath, who is CEO of Verizon Consumer. And Sampath was also a Questrom MBA graduate a number of years ago. I won't tell you how many. And he was my student. And what was interesting is Sampath right now is the head of Verizon Consumer, and he wrote one paper for me. And what was that on? Consumer preferences. So maybe, you know, a number of years ago you had an idea of what was going to happen.
You were quite a lenient grader, I remember. Thank you for the grade there.
Thank you, Sampath. So in simple terms right now, we have a direct connection to the telephone's past, as well as a direct connection to the telephone's current time. And why do we have a direct connection to the current time? Because when Alexander Graham Bell created the Bell system, the Bell system's area where they put out telephones is where Verizon's basic geographic area is today. So we have a direct connection between Alexander Graham Bell's past and current, and hopefully your questions will help us understand the future. So what's going to happen today is I'm going to ask about 20 to 30 minutes of questions. I'm going to start off with some easy softball questions, and then we'll work up to harder questions, and then we'll have 10 or 15 minutes for you, and then there'll be another panel after this which will be just as interesting. So let's start off with really easy questions that, you know, that's hopefully everyone can hit right out of the park. So communication has changed rather dramatically over the last few years. Some people call constantly. I have a number of students who look at me like, talk on the phone? I only text, I only message, or I only use apps. So what role does the phone, Sara, play in your life? And then Sampath, you're going to get the same question.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Oh, good, good. Just like the phone was revolutionary in its time, it has evolved, and so has my usage. I now use the text, the email, the phone, the apps, but when I want to make a human connection, I use the phone. I want to hear the voice, the tone, the emotion, the mood, and have an open-ended conversation instead of one that ends in an emoji. So that's how the phone works for me.
All right, Sampath, and remember you're on live stream right now as, you know, CEO of Verizon Consumer. How do you use the phone?
It's a great thing. But you know, phone breaks down the tyranny of distance. You know, that's how I look at it. Like anywhere in the world, it breaks down distance in a way no other technology can. Whether you text, whether you talk, it doesn't matter. The original thought Bell had was to break down the tyranny of distance. When he had to connect 2 points that could not be traveled quickly, how do you break that thing down? So for me personally, look, phone is probably the most important thing I have in my life. One, I work on it every morning from 6 a.m. till whatever time I go to bed. So it's a thing I spend most of my life doing that. But think about it, when you go somewhere, many of you forget your car keys, you forget your house keys, you forget your wallet, you never forget your phone. That's how important the phone is. If you get mugged, they say, you know, phone or your wallet, most people just give their wallet away. So.
Well, hopefully neither one of us is going to get mugged either today or in the near future. So let me ask you a question. Would you vacation, Sampath? And then Sara, you get the same question. Would you vacation in a place with no phone service? And let me tell you that 3 years ago, my wife, who's sitting in the front row, and we went to Antarctica for 3 weeks, and there was no phone service in Antarctica. And I thought that was one of the most unique experiences of my life, not seeing glaciers or things like that, but no phone for 3 weeks.
You know, I may be able to survive it, my kids will not be able to. It's very difficult to be disconnected from the phone, because so much of your life and who you are as an extension of who you are gets shown up in the phone today. Your personality, your relationships, your people, your commerce, every single thing you do goes through the phone. So it's very difficult to go on a vacation without the phone. I did try to go on a vacation without the phone, and then something happened at work, and then someone tracked me down, and I got a phone, and it didn't.
So it sounds like you'd sign up for satellite service if you went to Antarctica.
Yes. We'll talk a little bit about satellites and how different they are today than they were 10 years ago and what's happened there. It's very fascinating, probably the most advanced tech I've ever seen in the last 30 years happen in satellite, but yes.
You want to elaborate a little bit more on satellites?
Yeah, look, I think, and I'm sure pick it up later in the conversation, satellite historically has been this thing that NASA did with very few people, and part of that was the cost to send a kilogram to space. Back in the space shuttle era, it was $55,000, $60,000 to send 1 kilogram up to space. $55,000 to $60,000. Today, the Falcon 9 is going to do it at $30 a kilogram. So you're going to go from $54,000 a kilogram to $30 a kilogram. Jeez, that's 99.7% reduction in cost. So because of that, you're going to be able to send hundreds of thousands of satellites up in space, and it's going to change what is terrestrial networks and what is satellite networks. That line is going to blur very, very quickly. Starlink, you're starting to see that, but you're going to see those two lines merge. Today on your cell phone, you can receive satellite. Just think about it. You're sitting on your cell phone, when you're not in a space that has a network, the satellite connectivity takes over. From your cell with so little power, you can reach a satellite that's like 600-700 miles in space. You do something and you get a signal back. That's how good the technology is. And you're going to just see a lot more progress on that, Jay.
Sarah, we'll leave satellites, we'll go back to vacationing.
Yeah, the question was about vacation. Yeah. And I go, thank you very much. I go to Nova Scotia, the Bredora Lakes, and Bell went up there and spent, he and Mabel, 30 years. And 7 generations of my family still go there in a little town in Cape Breton. But when I was little, we had wooden crank phones mounted on the wall. And it was sometimes open, a line, or sometimes not. So I had an elderly aunt, Elsie, who loved to just sit on the phone and listen to everybody's business. And sometimes she might say, hello, I'm still here. But our ring was 4 longs. And today, my, ironically, cell phone service, which is Verizon, in Nova Scotia doesn't work. But it's gotten so much better. It's gotten so much better. I'm not complaining. But, you know, you can get away from a phone sometimes on a hike or on sale or something like that, which I appreciate.
It was amusing because Alexander liked going up to the Cape Bretons because it got him away from everything.
Exactly, because he was like the Carl Sagan of his era, and he wanted to go find a place where he could invent. He could no more stop inventing than stop breathing. And they looked at all the usual places along the eastern seaboard and then landed in Nova Scotia, and they just loved it. And as I said, all our family still goes there, and it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And the biggest thing was Mabel and, or Gammy and Grandpa, as the family called them, their daughters could wear pants, and that was very important to them. And they had lots of space.
All right, so Alexander Graham Bell is most famous for inventing the telephone, but he invented many other things. There have been a number of assassination attempts on presidents, and when President Garfield was shot, he invented a machine for detecting bullets in bodies, which was used quite successfully during World War I. He also helped invent the airplane, so the next time you hop on an airplane, like this evening, to fly back home, you can thank Alexander Graham Bell for some of these inventions. He did not invent a time machine. Unfortunately, I would have loved to have gone back in history and meet him. But let's assume that he did invent a time machine. I'm going to ask a pretty simple question, Sarah. If you could go back in time and spend just a couple of minutes with your great-grandfather, you know, which of all the moments in his life would you have liked to have been there?
I'd love a time machine to tell me which question you're asking when, because my notes, because Bell had, there were so many deep details. Remember, I have them in order. But you're asking me now the question of what I would want to do. Go back in time, yes. To see Mabel and Alec, they had an incredible love story. And as you know, she lost her hearing at 5 from scarlet fever. And he was a 3rd generation elocution teacher of the deaf. And they met when she was in Boston with a tutor, and because she'd had 5 years of education, she spoke well, and her family really wanted to continue her education, and there weren't many options in those days. An option would be to send her to an asylum. So they sent her to Boston to a tutor, and in Boston, she met Bell. And she was 16 and he was 26. And she thought he was kind of rough around the edges. He was a Scotsman, and so they met. But my point is, I'd love to see how they interact, because she was the the woman behind the throne. She was so powerful and in her own right devised a lot of things. And we joke in the family that Belle wouldn't be anywhere without her. She was an extraordinary woman. So I'd love to see how they interact.
All right, Sampath, we have the same time machine, but instead of going back in time as a CEO, at least one of my students are always asking me, how do we predict the future? So let's assume that you can jump 15 or 20 years ahead of time, and you're still deeply involved in the telecommunications business. What do you predict is the future? You gave us a little bit of a hint with the satellites there. What do you think is going to happen in the future of communications?
I think let me start with what customers are going to see. You're going to see always on communication that is pervasive everywhere, that talks to people, talks to things, that's always on, very low latency, very high bandwidth, in a way you've not seen before. So anything you walk into a house, you walk there, you don't have to log in anywhere, it's just on every single place that you go. Two is everything that you see around you is going to be connected. The chair you're sitting on is going to be connected because someone at the end of the session is going to have to collect the chairs and take it somewhere. So you're going to see a connected chair, everything around you. So things are going to get connected, people are going to get connected, and you're going to see this pervasive connectivity. When you take it down one level below in technology, on the wireline side of the business, you're going to see fiber and AI infrastructure start coming together. So as AI infrastructure gets built out more and more, most of the AI infrastructure is getting built out in these large data centers, but you're going to see a lot more AI infrastructure getting built at the edge of a network. So what is an edge of a network? The edge of the network is at the edge of Boston, because otherwise the data has to go all the way from Boston to Virginia and come back. But if you're inferencing, if you're driving an autonomous car, if the data goes all the way to Virginia and comes back, you're going to crash into someone. So how do you put data at the edge? So you're going to see this combination of fiber and large sets of AI infrastructure at the edge of the network, and you're going to see this. Second, you're going to see networks that are sensing. Today, networks don't sense very well. What does sensing mean? Looking at the network, you're going to be able to say, what's the temperature? What's flying in the air? It's like a radar. You're going to know drones. You're going to pick up small objects. You're going to look at people. So the network's going to become a living thing that's going to be able to sense and analyze things much better than it's doing today. On the wireless side of the business, what are you going to see? You're going to see satellite and terrestrial networks come together. Because of, as I said, the cost is coming, the cost curves, it's probably the most dramatic cost curve I have ever studied in my life. The only one that comes close to it is Moore's Law, but I think the satellite costs are going to come down faster than even Moore's Law. So pervasive, always on, bringing AI infrastructure and connectivity together to ensure that connectivity is available every single place, every time with very, very low latency.
As a Verizon shareholder, what you just said scares me, because what you just said is that if we're putting AI on the edge, I don't need to communicate over Verizon's network to Virginia. And if we're putting all these things so close together, why do I need a telecommunications company?
Jay, if you look at the history going back to the Bell time to us, there's always been this shift between, is the value in the long-haul network or is the value in the core metro access network? See, that's the economic question we keep asking. So is the value between connecting you from here to the central office, which is actually just down the street here, or is it the value from connecting the central office into the core network? And these curves go up and down. When Bell started, all the value was in the long distance network because that was his thing, I connect people. Then the fiber boom happened in the 2000 where all the value shifted to these long haul networks. People are investing fiber, they were just digging up trenches, putting fiber everywhere. A lot of value shifted there. Then there was a glut, there was too much of it. So all the value shifted back to core access networks. At the end of the day, if you can't connect to the network from your home or your cell, it doesn't matter what the network does. So these transitions go back and forth. Right now, I think most of the value today sits in the short haul network. And short haul networks are going to get even more impactful than they ever have, but it's also very hard to deploy short haul networks because it's distributed, you have to deploy it across the country, you have to spend a lot of capital doing it. So it's actually extremely beneficial for players like us. Now look, Verizon operates in a market where there are probably 2 to 2.5 players in any given market. And it's a very good place to be in because you have access to these short-haul networks.
All right, I'm not selling my shares. Okay. Sara, I want to switch back to historical times. Alexander Graham Bell had many, many different accomplishments in many different areas. One of the things that many people don't know about, for example, is he helped found National Geographic, right? A magazine that I remember reading quite a bit. He also helped find Science, the magazine for more academic people, as well as other periodicals. If you had his whole life, which accomplishment were you most proud of? Like growing up, were you bragging to your high school friends and your college friends? Like,
no, I was mostly keeping it quiet because it's surprising to people, frankly. But I started the foundation, Alexander and Mabel Bell Legacy Foundation, 14 years ago because about his accomplishments, as you discussed, there was a lot of inaccuracy. And you know, the internet is like the game of whack-a-mole, and you just have to keep addressing inaccuracies if you care. And Bell died in 22, and Mabel died suddenly in 23. And suddenly, my grandparents had to deal with their estates and objects and papers and everything. And the family, as I mentioned, is very modest. They're very hands-off. And so there wasn't really a way to keep the records straight. There wasn't an association or there's a museum, a wonderful one in Nova Scotia, but their job is not public relations. Their job is not promoting and preserving. But to your point, I mean, it's hard to pick one thing because he had 30 patents, 12 of them in collaboration. He launched the phone at 29, basically the modern telecommunications industry, connecting, as you said, people worldwide and saving lives. But I would have to say that what he was most proud of was his photo phone, which sent a beam of light to his cousin in the building next door and was the precursor really to fiber optics. He was very excited about that. So, but there were many other things.
All right, Sampath, we have lots of MBA students sitting here, many of taking some of my classes. If you were to sort of look back, in your life is not over, so I'm not trying to say this is the end, but what is so far your proudest accomplishment?
Look, I think it's been building the fiber network in America. You know, that's been, for the last 10, 12 years, that's a big portion of what I've been doing is building fiber. And one of the most fun projects I had was large parts of America had fiber except the city of Boston. You know, the Fios network came very, very recently to Boston. And part of it was we could never get alignment with the union and the mayor and the company. We could never get those 3 dots covered. So we built fiber everywhere. We built it across the 495 corridor. We built it pretty much everywhere in the Northeast except in Boston. Which was very strange. So I picked up, and my chairman at that time was like, Sampath, you need a real job, so go and build the network in Boston. It was very hard, but we got it done. This was a couple of years ago, 7, 8 years ago. We got the wireline fiber network built out in Boston. And since then, I'm just building fiber. You know, something called One Fiber, which is the largest long-haul, metro-haul network in the world, probably. I built that. So just adding more and more infrastructure to the ground has been probably one of my proudest accomplishments. But again, these things don't happen in isolation. It doesn't happen by me. We have large teams of some of the finest engineers in the world, some of the finest lawyers in the world to go and do that. But Verizon today has the best fiber on earth, and I'm very happy to have played a big role in that.
And I will say that I was one of your stumbling blocks, so let me tell you, Sampath, that I have a Verizon landline, and it was copper up until 6 weeks ago. When they finally switched me over to Fios, and they kept coming to the door every, I'd say, what would you say, every 2 weeks?
6 weeks,
Every 6 weeks, okay. Every 6 weeks they come ring the doorbell. Can we please change you from copper to fiber? And I was like, oh, I just love my copper. I like old things.
But you know, let's talk about that. So the copper network that's there in America, her great-grandfather put it down. So just think about it. For 100+ years, we've had the copper network work its way through. And only now, like 10 years ago, I started the network transformation project to shut down copper and move to fiber. Even now, it's not done. It's going to take another 10, 15 years to do that. So just think about how powerful the copper network is today. You know, like some of the largest organizations in the world till recently used to run on copper network. The universities here, the airports here. By the way, one of the more interesting customers is the Massachusetts Lottery Commission. They run their whole network on copper networks. Every time you go and put in a number, it runs on there. So the copper network has stood the test of time and has served close to 100 years. And now we are finally at the stage where we want to shut it down. You know why we want to shut it down is quite interesting. One is fiber is just more reliable, you can send more. But the other thing is power consumption. You know, copper networks consume 10 times more power than a fiber network. So you also tend to do that. They also take up a lot more space. You know, they take up 10 to 12 times more space in a place because you've got to put all these frame relays and other things there. So we are finally, as a country, we are working closely with the government because the phone, you know, we are kind of what we call the carrier of last resort. In other words, we cannot leave America, we cannot leave rural America without having a connection in their home. Whether it's a wireless connection, wireline connection, we own that, or we kind of owe that to society at large. So how quickly can the industry shut down the copper network, roll out fiber network is a very big thing, and it's a very complicated business problem as well because people like Jay here don't want to give up their phone. And till Jay shuts it down, I can't shut down the network in that town. So single-handedly, one person can hold up the whole society's progress here. Not that Jay would, but one person could.
We'll stay with you for a moment, and Sara, you'll get the second question. You started off at Questrom MBA, you then went to BCG, and then you came sort of into the communications. So when you were my student, you weren't talking to me, oh, I want to be, you know, kingpin in the telecommunications business. What surprised you when you went into the telecommunications business, and what's continuing to surprise you?
How many of you have a phone connection? Raise your hand. Yeah, use your hands, take it up, I know. Okay, every one of you have a phone connection. What's really interesting is in the phone industry, we've solved most of the complexity that the technology provides. Like, think about it. You know how to use your phone. It's pretty straightforward, whether it's the home internet, whether it's the cell phone, whether it's a landline. You don't need an instruction manual to use it, correct? It's pretty straightforward, every single day. But as an industry, we haven't solved the commercial part of it. Try navigating through a typical bill on a month and explain it to me how your bill works. It's still pretty complex. So as an industry, we've made massive progress on the technology side where we've deployed some pretty cutting-edge technology at scale that works really well. But the commercial side of the business, we have not done a good job of. And you would think that should be the easy part. How complicated can a bill be? Well, go and look at your bill tonight. So I think that's the piece that has surprised me. And if you see calls that come in, you know, we get, I'm going to round it up, but we get 1 million calls a day coming into our centers. The vast, vast, vast majority of those calls don't have anything to do with technology. The vast majority have to do with the commercial construct, the bill or a payment or some plan they don't understand. It's not good. As an industry, I feel the technology should have been the complex part, not the commercial part. So we've got a lot of work to do, simplification, making it easy. You don't need a PhD to go through a phone bill. And so I think we've got work to do.
I guess since I taught you pricing, for your MBA, I will hang my head in shame that the bill is still much more complicated than it's supposed to be.
Look, but on the other hand, Professor, as a pricing optimizer, we've optimized pricing better than anyone else. So there is complexity that we've pushed on to customers, but if you look at our yield, it's a very, look, I mean, think about it. It's a company that's, like my business is $100 billion plus in like mid-30s margin. We got pricing right.
I'll sleep easy tonight. Sara, if we could go back to your great-grandfather, excuse me, what would one thing surprise the audience about great-grandpa?
I'll just say 3 quick things, because there's so much, but just in a nutshell, he wouldn't have a phone in his office. He said it's too big a distraction. Secondly, he liked to swim at night naked on his back smoking a cigar, even in the rain. He just loved nature, he loved being out in nature, and it got him away from the phone. So, and then the third thing that's really important is both he and Mabel were progressives. They supported universal suffrage, they protested against racial segregation, and as I said earlier, they moved to Nova Scotia so their daughters could wear pants and be free to explore their lives up there. So, anyway.
Right, so the Mehrotra Institute is very much interested in understanding, for those who don't know the Institute, how business, society interact, right? And one of the interesting things right now is we're going through an area of incredible innovation, especially with artificial intelligence. So it's pretty much the same question from both of you, right? If we're looking for the next Bell-like innovation, you know, the thing that's going to change the way we view the world. And I would say that the telephone changed the way people interacted with each other and how they interacted with the whole world. You know, what should we focus on? Should we be focusing on things like science policy? Should we be focusing on universities? Should we be focusing on freeing up businesses? I'm not trying to limit you to anything. So Sampath, why don't you go first, since Sara was just answering a question.
I think at the core of this, it is how fundamental research is funded in this country. That's the core of this. I mean, look at the Bell Labs. I mean, they had semiconductor, photonics, wireless, of course the phone, all came out of the Bell Lab. Someone has to fund fundamental research in the country. And it's either going to be the government or it's going to be corporations. And it may have to be sectorally different. Today, if you look at all AI, all innovation on AI, the government doesn't have much to do with it. It's all funded by the Googles. Like the first big transformer paper was written by Google. It is funded there. You know, NVIDIA is funding a lot of the research. Google is funding. Meta's funding. Amazon's funding. So you're seeing the shift in AI, which is very company-led, very industry-led to support that. If you look at healthcare, it tends to be a balance between, you know, the NSF and universities, a combination of those two to being there. But who funds research is super important, because let me talk a little bit about America. Look, it's also the 250th birthday of America this year. And if America wants to be competitive long-term as a nation, you're going to have to fund fundamental research more. The tax code is quite favorable right now. You can write off all your research in the year you spend it. As a tax accountant, it's a good thing. But I think that's probably the most important thing to furthering innovation. You either have to make it super exciting for companies to do that, or government's going to have to fund it. But you cannot walk away. The second is the split of research money between applied research and fundamental research. These shifts over a period of time, many in the room know that. Always going to have a balance, because if you want ROI, it's very easy to do applied research, because you can take return on investment. It's a 10-year horizon. You can go and extract value quite quickly from it. But if you want 20, 30, 40-year innovation, you're going to have to fund fundamental research to do that. Today, countries outside the US are funding fundamental research better. China is one that's funding fundamental research a lot better, a lot more aggressively. So as a nation, we got to, I think AI timing was good. We got the right companies involved in it. But longer term competitiveness, we're going to have to fund fundamental research in this country at the government level.
All right, Sara, you can answer the same question, either channeling your great-grandfather or channeling yourself. Your call.
No, I totally agree with Sampath. And it would be a combination of educators, like here at BU, with business, and hopefully government grants. I know these are challenging days, but to create a pipeline, to continue to create that pipeline of ideas and entrepreneurs and future inventors.
Which is interesting, since Alexander Graham Bell, outside of his one-year paid sabbatical, did lots of things, but wasn't given government grants or any of these other things.
That's a good point. Yeah.
All right, so
but you know, Jay, also the cost of doing investment has gone up significantly right now, because we are in a world of big compute, big infrastructure. Pretty much anything we touch, whether it's material science, biological science, healthcare, it all goes through compute today. So the cost of research has gone up significantly in a way that's not scaled very well. So you're going to need government more involved in providing access to some basic capabilities. Earlier, basic capabilities was you need an office, you need some lab space, you need some people to help you. That was what's needed to drive. Today, just give me tokens, give me access to infrastructure, I'll go and do it. So the currency of what you invest in innovation has changed. And we're going to have to find a better way to fund the new currency, which is basically compute, from pretty much most of the verticals that you see today.
Okay. Maybe you're suggesting taxing AI companies?
You know, spending someone else's money is always easy, you know?
It is.
It's a very easy thing to spend someone else's money. So look, it all comes, who you tax, you know, there are sources of cash and the uses of cash. And they don't always have to align with each other. But as a society, you're going to have to find pools of money to invest right now in compute. For example, if I'm a startup today, okay, if you're a startup today, what can you give them? Earlier, you gave them an office space and said, come and work in this accelerator or this lab. Today, all they tell you is just give me $20,000 of AWS credit. Just give me $20,000 of AWS credit, or give me, you know, 2 billion tokens of OpenAI. I'll go and start something. So the currency has shifted massively, and I think how we fund things, how grants are written, how support is given, hasn't changed fast enough. And look, America has a very rich VC community, but you know, you got to have something in the public era, in the public domain as well, to fund some of those things.
All right, let's shift to a little bit more about the convenience of telecommunications. Sara, the first time I met you was on Zoom, and I happened to be visiting grandchildren on the West Coast. The second time, my wife was driving down the road, and I was talking to you on my cell phone. And this is the third time we've actually met actually in person. So telecommunications provides incredible convenience. But part of that convenience, Sampath, you were saying that the chair is going to be monitoring me, right? You said that about 30 minutes ago, which means maybe I ate too much. It's going to check on my weight and these kind of things, you know, and then send me an ad for maybe a medicine that might reduce my weight or something else like that. So what is the line between privacy and connectivity? We'll go for Sara first, because Alexander Graham Bell was a very private individual, as I've read. He did not really want people to be involved in his personal life.
Yes. Privacy is a huge concern. And I think it becomes a design challenge for the phone. And keeping it accessible, and it's a tough one. It's going to need research, and Sampath can speak much more to the specifics of keeping privacy, but it's essential. I mean, we have lost so much of it. And like in Europe, they worry about this, of course, too, and they have put in more controls for privacy, and government funds more controls. So I don't know whether that's the answer here or not.
Sampath, what do you think? Because
let me pick up the European comment from Sara here. So, you know, Europe has this GDPR environment, which is, at the end of the day, it's just an annoying yes that you click up to every pop-up that comes before you go to any European website. In effect, you think you have privacy, you have control. In reality, you have nothing. 99.99% of people just click yes and get to the content that they want. So I get privacy. I think privacy in itself is not, people don't get bothered by privacy. For example, look at all the ads that you get served up on your phone. You don't have a problem with the ads that get come. You have access to travel data. When you travel, Google Maps tracks you, you know where you went. If you go to Meta, you can even track who you sat next to, because the social graph gets built around it. So a combination of people can get a lot more. I think what's more important is who has access to it, who does what with it, what is the control. The actual act of collecting data is not something that customers get very skewed about. What they get upset about if wrong people get access to it and what they can do to it. So I think we're going to have to reframe privacy a little bit more around access as opposed to collecting the data to do that. The second thing I find is when data is used to serve a customer, he or she is very happy. For example, how many of you shop at Amazon? Okay, many of you. Isn't it great that Amazon knows when the toilet paper is running out in your house?
No.
Why? Because think about it. How many, I think it's a generational thing, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Most customers want to know, it's been 3 months since I last ordered toilet paper. I'm kind of a 3-month kind of guy, I take X boxes. At 3 months, it pops up straight. Do you want to click on toilet paper? You click yes. And then most people go and do that down the line. Most people today, an average teenager spends 4 hours a day on TikTok. 4 hours a day, an average teenager spends on TikTok. We should talk about that. Is it too much, too less? Almost everything that gets served on TikTok is based on algos and very, very advanced targeting that they have. I don't see anyone complaining about that. Like, for example, I'm a big cricket fan. I like watching cricket videos now. Big tournament is starting, so I'll get a lot of cricket and I'll get caught into that world. So I think privacy is, there's this old concept of privacy which basically came from the World War II era, with a lot of East German, West German type things, where it's, state control and things like that. In today's world, privacy is more around serving customers, giving them what they want, personalizing them, giving things to their benefit. If companies walk that line carefully, they're not creepy about it. I tell my teams, don't be creepy. If you're not creepy about privacy, customers are fine with it. If you're creepy, you're going to get into trouble. And you're going to have to learn it the hard way to do that. So the benefits of communication, the benefits of personalization, far outweigh some of the risks you have. Now look, there are certain areas of privacy that I'm very clear about. One is domestic violence, crimes that are committed. Those are things, there's black and white. Very clearly, we're going to have to monitor for those situations and care for them. But by and large, the benefits massively outweigh some of the risks that privacy have. And look, Europe has supposedly taken a slightly better thing. How many of you use one service that's European right now? I rest my case.
I would love to continue this conversation, but I promised Crystal that we would stay on time, so I'm going to ask each of you one last concluding question. And I'm sorry, there were so many other questions that I would love to have asked both of you. So Sara, what advice do you think Alexander Graham Bell would give to a young inventor, an innovator, or someone interested in starting a world-changing company today?
Yeah. Bell would...
Can you pick up the microphone?
Thank you, sorry about that. Bell had a restless curiosity and passion for investigating new frontiers. My father, who knew him well, would say, Grampy could no more stop inventing than stop breathing. Because as we know, he turned from the phone at 29, he went on to hydrofoils, metal detector, the precursor to the respirator. He even believed radium could cure cancer, and he got a doctorate for that. So he would say, keep curious and be passionate. He'd also say, be persistent, don't give up. He would say, when one door closes, another one opens. And the other thing he would say is, leave the beaten track and dive into the woods. And you're certain to find something you haven't seen before. And the other thing, the last thing, is hire and develop great people, like his wife Mabel did. She noticed that he was kind of losing some hearing and slowing down a little bit, so she recruited 4 gentlemen, and they formed the Aerial Experiment Association. In 1907, they were engineers, and so basically she was the first woman to start an aviation company or be an investor in an aviation company. And these engineers went on to develop the June bug, and the June bug won the Scientific American Prize for the first flight of a kilometer in public. And public is very important because at that time, the Wright brothers, of course, had flown, but they were only in private. So that goes to your privacy point, too. Anyway, he thought, you should share ideas, so he was very open about that.
Develop people, so the Watson family. Thank you very much, because I think maybe he developed Thomas Watson and Thomas Watson developed Alexander Graham Bell. Sort of a connection. Sampath, we have many MBAs both watching on the television, or excuse me, no one watches television anymore. It's on YouTube, all right? And we have many MBAs here. What advice would you give so that in 15 or 20 years I'm sitting up here with one of them?
I think couple of things. There's going to be a lot of disruption in jobs over the next 5-10 years. It's very difficult to figure out what exactly the disruption is. But a couple of things. Largely specialization will be, and you and I suspect will argue on this, which I'm excited about. Specialization is a good thing. When you come into the workforce, I think being a specialist is better than being a generalist. Because as a generalist, you have so much competition right now. Like, for example, even marketing. Oh, I'm a marketeer. Yeah, you and 87,000 other people. But I'm a digital marketeer in this particular space around segmentation of customers. Yeah, there is a path for you, and then you can build on that. So I think early in your career, being a specialist is much more important. As you go later in your career, when you become overhead like myself, then you start covering more broader things in life. So I think that's one. The second is there are some fundamental skills that I think are super important. The first is communication. I think this is one area where the phone has actually not helped. People need to learn to communicate in written language, in spoken language, and not in emojis. I do think communication is a skill that's going to be massively important. It's going to become more and more important, not less important, because as you have to communicate people to ideas to that. Second is how you bring people together from different fields to work together on a problem. Because most large problems today are multifunctional problems. For example, if you're solving a healthcare, you're trying to invent a new gene therapy, you're going to have one of the best computational scientists with one of the best healthcare scientists, with some of the best clinical researchers in place to pull that together. So how do you build a coalition of people? And it starts with projects at the MBA school. Like, I know it's always annoying because there's always that one person in your project who doesn't show up. I know the feeling, I've been there. But how do you continue to develop teams and work towards that? And the last important one is the intersection of arts and science. I think one of the greatest inventors in the world, Bell, was also Da Vinci. And he was at the intersection of art. I always think, at the intersection of art and science. So knowing something that's just outside your core skill, and then you got to be curious. You have to go down rabbit holes. Like when I hire people, I look for a spike. What is the one thing they spike in? And curiosity is a great thing to spike in, because if you're curious, you will solve business problems along the way. But curiosity doesn't happen one fine day when you come in. It has to start early. You have to be massively, massively curious and go down these rabbit holes. And technology helps you go down rabbit holes.
So be a curious music minor, but get an MBA.
Yeah, exactly. And then Alice in Wonderland, go down the rabbit hole. You'll find something.
We have about 5 minutes for taking questions from the audience, but since this is on YouTube and live stream, Crystal will bring a microphone to you, so if you could raise your hand.
Okay, it's thing in 5 minutes, so I'll make it very brief. I think communicating is very important, but no longer is working anything to do with the telecommunication industry. And I think Alexander Graham Bell would be shocked that it still exists, because he solved an interesting problem. He had two demo endpoints, like tin cans, and he had to connect the string or the sound wave between the two, and that was an amazing feat. Today, we have smart endpoints. With voice over IP is nothing like the traditional telephone. There's no reason to have a telecommunication industry as it was still 1876. We need a common infrastructure based on the new technologies. And again, I can't go into full detail, but it's an interesting discussion is why has it been so, you talk about the support, talked about support for Bell in the old days. So the interesting business question is, why have we still stuck 50 years after the endpoints became smart? This, as I said, 5 minutes is too short a time. All I can do is whet the appetite if I'm lucky.
I was a little unclear. You were cutting in and out, and it was very hard to hear the question. Could you give us a quick summary of the question again?
Yes, thank you.
Industry based on domain points when all the 100% of the value is created outside the network. Why don't we have an infrastructure that facilitates a digital infrastructure as opposed to an 1876 telecom infrastructure?
Yeah, look, I think just from an architecture of the network, supporting massive endpoints is the end goal. Like, we want a situation, one of the things 5G and eventually 6G will do is support millions, if not billions, of endpoint to do that. That's the goal. That's all we're in. Say that again?
You'd like to talk later.
Okay, we'll do that. I look forward to that.
Great.
There's drinks at the bottom, so we'll pick that up.
We have time for one more question before the next panel. Is there one more question in the audience?
In the back.
Sure. This is John Duffy. I teach at the University of Virginia. And I was just wondering if you could comment on something that was a hot topic about a decade ago, which was net neutrality. And I think many people back then, had arguments for treating things neutrally, but other people said, like, you want to prioritize certain communications and other things like that. And I just wondered, that seems to have vanished. And I wonder especially, I would love to hear somebody from industry give us some insights into why that debate seems to be gone now.
I think net neutrality was a hammer looking for a nail. And look, I've been in the industry my whole life, 20 years at least since I've graduated from college. I never realized what problem it was trying to solve. I still don't know what problem it's trying to solve today. So there's been so much energy, time chasing net neutrality when it really didn't solve a problem. Then people realized it's not a big thing and they moved on. Netflix was the perfect thing, but Netflix made this huge issue about net neutrality. And all they wanted was access to certain endpoints so they could cache their local content. We're like, sure, come and cache. It's the easiest thing in the world. They're peering points. You put your access in peering points. It's a free access. So I think that went away. The second is excess bandwidth solved that problem. If bandwidth was massively constrained, then what Jay said and I said, there's only space for one car. It's not like the mass pike. It's not like the mass pike where there's constrained lanes and then there's traffic and you have to monitor traffic. Largely, there's so much of bandwidth available right now that anyone can go through. It doesn't prioritize. You don't need to prioritize. There is some situations where we need to prioritize, mostly for national security, for public safety type of environments, or when one user is hogging way too much of their bandwidth. So we still have some of those places in place. At the end of the day, explosion of bandwidth solved a lot of the problems that there was. That's why net neutrality really didn't get much traction in society and in the policy world that we live in.
So I'd like to say thank you, Sara, for helping explain the past. Sampath, thank you very much for helping explain the current. And thank you all for listening and thinking a little bit about the future of telecommunications.
Thank you.
It's okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for sticking with us, and thank you to the first panelists. That was fantastic, and I think it was the connection to the history of the phone, both personal in terms of family and personal in terms of today's telecommunications business, was kind of a great setup for this second act of our event commemorating the 150th anniversary of the patenting of the phone. So what this panel is it's a group of business and economic historians. And our objective for the next 30, 45 minutes is to have a conversation about what the history of the telephone could perhaps teach us about innovation systems. So taking a bit of a larger perspective, and thinking about the role in the innovation process of different actors, whether those are individual inventors like Alexander Graham Bell, universities like Boston University, businesses like Verizon, or the government, as we heard, which plays a large role in funding and financing different aspects of the innovation system. So for years, I taught a course at Questrom called Technology Strategy, and one of the first lessons in that class was this distinction between invention and innovation. We're here to commemorate an invention, the process that led up to the patenting of a system for transmitting voice over telegraphy. But we would not be here commemorating the invention if it did not become an innovation. What the distinction means is that there was a lot of investment. Johns Hopkins, with appointments in the School of Government and Public Policy, as well as the Carey School of Business there. Bhavin is an expert on innovation systems. And to his right is Shane Greenstein, the Martin Marshall Professor of Business Administration at that other Boston Business School. So to start, Rob, your book, The People's Network, it sort of traces the history of the telephone system, and in particular the way that people came to understand what that technology is and how it would be used. So I would like to start maybe at the beginning of that story with Alexander Graham Bell himself. Could you tell us a little bit about whether he actually understood what he was inventing, or how he did understand it at the time, and how that relates to how we understand it now?
Yeah, this is on. Okay, good. Thanks, Tim, and thanks to everyone here at BU for having us. Yeah, I mean, the simple thing to say is that it's an excellent question. Bell was a very clever guy, but he did not know he was inventing the telephone. They say that necessity is the mother of invention, the idea that when we identify a pressing need, somebody will come along and invent a tool that meets that need. And yes, but really the history of technology rarely works that way. Yes, there are incremental improvements, there are step-by-step advancements, and those may be predictable. But the real innovations, the real paradigm shifters are almost always unexpected. And it's only after they are invented, often, that we find out what they were useful for, or that we find out the form they're going to take, who's going to profit from them, who's going to control them. And that's a process that requires just as much innovation and ingenuity and serendipity as the original invention. And that's never more true than the telephone. So Bell, Bell was the son and the grandson and the nephew of a family of elocutionists. His grandfather is sort of thought to be the model for Henry Higgins in George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, which became My Fair Lady. Sort of he taught people how to speak, to lose their Cockney accents. Bell's life's work before the telephone was, he was fascinated by just the mechanics of how the human mouth, how sounds, the physics of sound, and how the human mouth creates speech. As a teenager, he and his brother built an automaton that sort of could speak, that sort of like they pump air through it and it sort of made words. He had a trick he would do with his dog where he would like move his dog's lips and squeeze its stomach so that the dog appeared to be saying, "How are you?" this was sort of just a fascination with him. And years later, he said, I invented a device by which the vibrations of speech could be seen, and it turned out to be a telephone. So he was interested in what are the vibrations of speech, and it turned out, he didn't know, to be a telephone. He didn't know it in advance. And we talked about, Sara Grosvenour talked about, Bell was 24 years old when he came to Boston to teach using his father's visible speech, which was a kind of a phonetic alphabet that was meant to represent any sound. And teaching the deaf to speak orally was, and not to learn sign language. This is the source of the sort of controversy, present-day controversy about Bell's work. But Bell was hired, he was hired in 1873 by Boston University's, I looked this up, fledgling School of Oratory as a part-time professor of vocal physiology and elocution. BU offered him $5 an hour for 5 hours a week, so it wasn't, and I hate to disagree with Jay. Jay said that he had a paid sabbatical, but actually, I think he did get paid in advance, but he wasn't on sabbatical, and I know this because one of the most relatable for me as a history professor things in the story of the telephone is after Bell's great triumph, an implacable foe, an enemy of the Western Union Telegraph Company. And Hubbard was a leading figure in the postalization movement. He's a decades-long crusade to get the US government, to get the US Postal Service to take over the telegraph. And when Bell finally confessed to Gardner Hubbard that he was in love with his daughter, Hubbard was not enthusiastic at all about the courtship, but when then Bell also mentioned that he was doing some experiments to do with the electrical transmission of sound, Hubbard suddenly got much more interested, and that this was a way that he could challenge the telegraph monopoly. But Hubbard did not expect or want to transmit the human voice. What Hubbard wanted, what everybody in the telegraph industry wanted in 1875, 1876, was a way to increase the bandwidth of the telegraph network. And the idea was, Edison had invented a device that let you send 2 messages along a wire at the same time. And they were working on a device that might be able to send 4 messages along a wire at the same time. Bell had this idea, if you could send sounds, like playing a chord on a piano, then you could split those sounds up on the other end, and each pitch, each note of the piano could carry a different message. And this was what Bell pitched to Hubbard was this sort of multiplex telegraph. And so, Hubbard was excited about that. That was an incremental improvement of the existing technology that he could understand how to monetize. But speech was like a toy. In April 1876, so a month after the history-making patent, a month after the history-making, Mr. Watson, come here, I need to see you. The month after, Hubbard was saying to Bell, if only you could come up with a good improvement on the telegraph. It's like after the telephone was invented, he said, if only you could come up with something useful, then your fortune would be assured, and then you could marry my daughter. So just the sort of, anyway, I've talked at length, but the point being that just, we don't know in advance what something is going to be. And I think, the kind of special alchemy of Bell himself was that he was torn between these 2 father figures. He was torn between his actual father, who had this system for making speech visible, and then the father of the girl he loved, impatient for something to challenge the Western Union monopoly. And it was the alchemy between these 2 visions that produced this, absolutely unexpected, but absolutely transformative invention.
Can I ask, so I had a prepared question, but let me go off script right away. That's how long, sort of there was a sense, you're telling us the story of Bell not quite understanding where this invention was going within months of having invented it. What was the time frame for the public to come up with an understanding of telephony and what the use case was?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that, because I would also say then that that's also a sort of period of innovation, right, and a long-term period. So the people that controlled the Bell Telephone Company, Bell did not personally stay that involved. And even Hubbard did not stay personally that involved. And the Boston bankers that soon dominated the Bell Telephone Company had a very specific idea, what I would say a conservative understanding of the telephone was a tool for business. It was kind of a luxury for the wealthy. You were meant to make your call, speak quickly, and get off the phone. It was not for frivolous uses. They worked very hard to keep women off the telephone, to keep servants off the telephone, the working classes, young people. In Canada, where I'm from, the president of Bell Canada said, "There's no use in marketing this to the French. They will never use it properly." So really, the two things that changed that, one is with the end of the patents, there was an explosion of competition and tens of thousands of smaller telephone companies that ranged from pretty large urban systems in direct competition with Bell. I think the sort of ancestors of Sampath's Verizon lie there. But also tiny little companies, 12 farmers would string up their own telephone system and make their own network. And so there's this furious innovation from outside the industry, but also furious innovation on the part of consumers. And people just, took to the phone and used it in all different ways. And ultimately, Bell and what became the Bell system regained its, sort of achieved a commercial monopoly over the telephone that it had for most of the 20th century, but only after the independents and the users had reinvented for a second time, at least a second time, or multiple times, what the telephone was and what it was for.
Yeah, shame on me. When I mentioned innovation systems, I think I talked about inventors, universities, business, and government. I left out demand, so fail your business school professor. So Bhavin, I'm going to turn to you now. A lot of your research focuses on a somewhat later era. You've done a lot of work on changes in the US innovation system during and after the Second World War. So if we move forward in time to that time period and we move from kind of the Victorian era innovation system to the post-war US innovation system, can you give us a few examples of technologies to fix ideas and then explain a little bit about how the process of commercializing had changed in that era?
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here. I don't have. I'll talk about World War II, which indeed was a watershed moment in the U.S. innovation system. I will say I don't have as much history as the previous occupant of this chair did, but I grew up in Western Massachusetts, Westfield, a town called Whip City sometimes, and we were supposed to have a field trip here in high school, and I was sick that day, and so it's always been a lifelong ambition to be back. So, thank you. Okay, before I get to World War II, just very quickly, in order to understand World War II and what it did, you actually go back to 1876. So we're here 150 years celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Bell invention, but other things are happening in 1876 too. What else is celebrating its 150th anniversary? Johns Hopkins University, right? Arguably the first American research university building on the German model, brought over to the US, and institutional innovation, and that percolates throughout the US innovation system. I believe, according to Wikipedia, that the first industrial research lab, Edison's in Menlo Park, also 1876, maybe even this week, 1876. And these are very different from the type of invention and indeed the process of innovation around the Graham patent. I mean, you can kind of view Alexander Graham Bell as the kind of high watermark of the age of the independent inventor, but at the same time he was doing his thing, the system was kind of shifting underneath his feet and in the US. So you have these industrial research labs, these research universities that really institutionalized the process of research, science, research, invention, and eventually become involved in the commercialization process as well. The big change, if 1876 is a hinge year, is World War II, when for the first time the US federal government gets involved in funding research outside of agriculture. And they do so in response to a crisis. And in that crisis, the side with the better science and technology was likely to have an upper hand. Good news and bad news from the US perspective. Good news because there are pockets of scientific and technological capability in the US. Industrial research labs, I think Bell Labs eventually becomes an epitome of that form. A great university system, but no way to kind of connect them, to create this connective tissue in the system, to mobilize them to respond to the crisis. And for the first time, we see, under the head of another local hero, Vannevar Bush, the development of federal funding of academic research and federal science policy. Yada, 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 Bush writes a report, Science, the Endless Frontier, sometimes considered, rightly or wrongly, the blueprint for post-war science and technology policy. And there we start seeing federal funding of research that was alluded to in the previous panel. National Science Foundations created in 1950. National Institutes of Health goes way back, but starts to fund extramural research. Department of Defense starts to fund research. Fast forward to the present moment, that set of arrangements that the federal government will support science at universities kind of lets scientists self-govern, leaving applied research to the quote-unquote market. First of all, it works differently in different sorts of industries, but at a high level, you can kind of think of that model as the Bush model. And suffice it to say that the evidence, first, it's under tremendous strain right now, maybe generational strain, and we can come back to that. But second, at a high level, it seems to have worked quite well. So I've done work in bio and pharma, suggesting the rate of return to that investment is quite high. I think both Tim and Shane have written about the role of this system of university research and university-industry relationships in shaping the early internet. Yet at the same time, I think there are some real pathologies in the system, and there's kind of a moment to rethink what's going to happen going forward. So why don't I leave it at that and turn it over to Shane.
No, I'm going to get one more out of you, Bhavin, before we give the mic to Shane. But since Bell was a university inventor, or at least we're claiming him.
Right.
Can you, if you take the perspective, or you put yourself in the shoes of a university scientist in 1876 versus 1960, or even, sort of maybe post-Bayh-Dole in the kind of what has changed?
Yeah, a lot, a lot. Yeah, so historically, universities, which are the kind of center of a lot of not only just science, but also invention and commercialization today, no more so than in the area we're speaking in today, historically they were actually quite reluctant to get involved in things like patents and commercialization. They would, people like Bell were allowed to do what they wanted to do. There was a kind of laissez-faire policy, but universities thought it was kind of untoward to get involved in patents and exclusivity when they were committed, on the German research university idea to dissemination of knowledge, open science, and things of that sort. What changes, it actually changes gradually over the course of the century, but again, World War II, once the public sector starts funding research, you start having debates about if the public sector is funding research, who gets the rights to any intellectual property that comes out of that? And those are big debates during World War II, the so-called Bush-Kilgore debates were centrally around that, where on one hand there was a point of view that if the public sector funds it, it ought to be in the public domain, otherwise taxpayers are paying twice. And another point of view, which Bush held on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, that if you don't give some exclusivity to the performer of the research or the university and allow them to license it out, including on an exclusive basis to firms, that the inventions, discoveries will languish on the shelf. Big fights about this in the decades after World War II. Different agencies do different things until in 1980, a piece of legislation called the Bayh-Dole Act is passed, which creates a uniform federal patent policy. After that, the story's more complicated, but for brevity, I'll give you the short version of it. Everything goes up. University patenting goes up, university licensing goes up, university entrepreneurship goes up. There's questions about how much of that is Bayh-Dole versus other stuff, but Bayh-Dole turns patenting and licensing from an activity that universities are sort of shy about to something that they kind of become invested in, and it becomes equated with universities fulfilling part of their mission to get technologies actually out there, and that's a big change. Originally about federally funded research. Today, I think most universities apply their patent policies to all research. So if we went back to the time machine on the previous panel, I think if Alexander Graham Bell was at Boston University today, he would be reporting his invention to BU's Tech Transfer Office. And an interesting counterfactual is, how would commercialization have been different in that context?
We would have had the Jenga building on ComAv much sooner. So, Shane, I'd like to turn to you now, and I thought it was interesting the passing the baton from Rob to Bhavin, this notion that the seeds of the post-war innovation system were sort of already in place in 1876, sort of with the start of labs in Menlo Park and kind of the early indications of the changes that were coming. I guess similarly here, you mentioned Bayh-Dole. What was the Bayh-Dole? It was 1980. That's really right around the beginning of the funding streams that led to the creation of the next biggest invention in telecommunications, which is the internet. You wrote a book about the commercialization of the internet. Could you tell us just a little bit about the early origins of that technology, kind of in particular, who funded it and where did the initial R&D take place?
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to celebrate the telephone and the 150-year anniversary. Thanks for having me. When you look at the origins of the internet, famously, most people know DARPA funds the earliest exploration of what we today call TCP/IP, which is packet switching that moves data between networks. They were trying to solve an actually rather narrow problem at the time for the Defense Department. That gets transferred, we inherit an internet, that particular invention gets transferred to the National Science Foundation, who's also trying to solve a particularly narrow problem, which is to help academic scientists communicate with each other. And the way I always like to explain it, there were multiple budgets funding the internet, and so multiple missions were being pursued at the same time, and the internet that we all inherit is a bit of a magpie of technologies. A magpie's nest, you grab from here and grab from there. The National Science Foundation, on the first order, wants an operational network. So it wants data to be able to go between scientists. It also has a scientific interest, so it funds new things among its university scientists, and there's also a community who's inventing things like email, that we also inherit. There's, at the same time, if we go a little bit fast forward into the early part of the 1990s, there's a part of the National Science Foundation that has noticed a lot of data, and libraries have a lot of data. Among the things they're funding is a research program out at Stanford to figure out how to make a search engine for libraries. In all seriousness, right? That's another thing they're funding. And by the way, what came out of that? Well, one day in 1996, Larry Page walks into the lab and asks his supervisor, "Do we have to work on libraries? Can we do search of this thing called the web?" And the advisor goes, "Oh, that's a good idea. Sure, go for it." And as I often like to point out, if we had a strict research set of rules, research rules, that would not be permitted because it was outside of the scope of what was proposed. But we have a rather flexible research system, and so they pursued what they did, and eventually that got commercialized. The last piece, which we have to give credit for, is not US funded at all, and that's the World Wide Web. Right? That comes from Tim Berners-Lee. He's employed in Europe, and we are fortunate that the institutions in Europe are brittle because he wanted to stay. And he asked he was at a nuclear lab, and he wanted to stay, and he'd already invented the World Wide Web. It is already in use. It is growing everywhere. And he asks if he can start the World Wide Web Consortium in France, to which he gets the answer, it's outside of the scope of our institution, can't do it here. So he moves to Cambridge. Cambridge, the US, not Cambridge, England. And the institutional flexibility of the US provides him a nurturing home, and so the World Wide Web ends up being our neighbor. So that's, when you look at those origins, that's just a lot of very different places it comes from.
Yeah, so two themes, just to sort of be didactic about it. One is borrowing. We borrowed the university model from the Germans. We borrowed Tim Berners-Lee from CERN in Switzerland. We're sitting in a building where the person who borrowed the design for the power loom decided to build, sort of the first U.S. Textile manufactory. The other one is this sort of serendipity and not knowing quite what you're inventing. And I don't know if I'll ask you to speculate about this, but in the case of the internet, the government had entered the picture in a way, right? Like, part of the story of the evolution that we're telling is the increased role for government funding. But that creates a certain amount of pressure on people who want to just be given a lot of money to do whatever and don't trust us, it'll work out fine. There are good reasons maybe to sometimes be skeptical of those kinds of justifications for your investment. But it works often. And so how were the people who invented and before commercializing the internet, were they in an environment where their government funding just let them do that sort of experimentation?
So there's, as Bhavin highlighted, the classic model is something is invented in the university, and then we find a way to transfer it into commercial markets. There's a tension there, and there's always been a tension at the National Science Foundation, even in its charter, that it cannot be funding things that are in direct competition with US industry. And in the case of the commercialization of the internet, that actually creates a huge tension when it comes time to transfer the operational network out of the NSF's governance into private governance. It also creates, at the time, I don't think it was appreciated, it creates this very peculiar gap. So just the best way to describe it is the nuts and bolts worked. So when in fact they overcome the tension, they have to get an act of Congress, and they commercialize the operation of TCP/IP, they privatize the backbone, so we get a privatized internet, and we start getting internet service providers who hook up to it, and you can start sending data. That works exceedingly well. All the nuts and bolts have been figured out. It scales remarkably well because they've had years and years and years of practice inside the university to figure out all the problems that were going to come up when you tried to scale. The thing they hadn't figured out is how to run electronic commerce, because they weren't allowed to, because that would have been in competition with private firms. So there weren't any experiments. So they had no idea. Somebody had to invent the cookie, as it were. Somebody had to invent how to get a transaction over the web. Somebody had to invent the micro processes that we now take for granted. And all of that was absent in 1995 for a reason, because universities were forbidden to go into those areas. And the second thing that produced that gap, if you talk to private firms, is they were surprised by the whole thing. So when writing this book, one of my most enjoyable interviews was with the guy who ran the lab at IBM at the time. And his remark was, everything that eventually developed in the internet, they had prototypes of at IBM. But all their prototypes were $1,000 more. They were 1,000 times more expensive, because they had never anticipated an open system, free software, the World Wide Web, a non-for-profit, generating the standards. They had imagined a completely proprietary system that would have been much, much more expensive. And so he said, in some sense, all their prototypes were useless. So there was this other gap that also emerged in 1996. And then we get the dot-com boom, which I think many people here lived through. And we can get to that if you want.
Can I ask about the first gap you just talked about, or about the handoff, really, from NSF to commercial backbone? You said something really interesting in the emails we were exchanging to get ready for this. I thought you wrote that the telephone had the telegraph to contend with, the internet had the telephone system to contend with, but in the latter case, it was not a competition, it was a forced partnership. Can you explain?
Yeah, so look, the internet and the telephone system today are best of buddies. So let's just, it's right, I think I could look over at you and say that. And that's a true fact. In 1981, certainly that's not the case, and in 1995, not the case. And the reasons, there were multiple reasons for it, but the telephone system at the time, there were multiple reasons. There's almost a where do we start here. The telephone system at the time had strong incentives to own everything that everybody was using. The regulatory system gave them strong incentives to own all the capital stock, all the capital, and put a rate base that was very large. In addition to telephone engineers and computer science communities, let's just say, not necessarily being the best of friends. And so there was this kind of tension at the time, and the Federal Communications in the United States engineered, starting in approximately 1981, 1982, a series of pretty severe rules. I don't know how else to describe them. Requirements that the telephone system had to support the experiments with the internet and had to support bulletin boards, if you remember them, which were the early internet service providers. And partly, some of the local telephone systems would have done it voluntarily, but some of them would not have, had they not been compelled. And some fought quite aggressively not to. And then after the breakup in 1984, after divestiture, still a lot of legacy of that tension all the way up until 1995. And then slowly it dropped away. And certainly by 96, 97, it's gone, partly because local telephone companies made a lot of money on the second lines everybody was putting in their houses. And then suddenly they thought, oh my gosh, this is our friend. Why are we opposing this? So, it switched relatively quickly. But in the earliest period in particular, yeah, the US had quite a strict system, unique in the world. I mean, Britain was the only other country that I know of that got close. Canada got a little bit close. And it was principally responsible for the extraordinary competitiveness of the ISP industry in the US right away, because there were so many people who could quite easily become ISPs. And then, as I said, very quickly, telephone companies switched because it became a very profitable thing to support the ISPs.
Thanks. So let me put one last kind of question or topic to the whole panel. This isn't for anyone in particular, but I think maybe you'll all have thoughts about it. This morning, we had another panel at Questrom that was about sort of the role of patents in the early Bell system. Suffice it to say, Alexander Graham Bell's ability to obtain this patent that happened 150 years ago this week, and his lawyers' vigorous and enthusiastic litigation of that patent played a tremendously important role in the emergence of the Bell system, the way that the industrial organization of telecommunications unfolded over the next decades. Now we're talking about the internet. With the internet, some of the key underlying technologies, like Tim Berners-Lee's protocols, the TCP/IP stuff that was developed inside universities during that era of gestation, were kind of made open. Both technologies were, I guess, probably were the two biggest telecommunications technologies of the last 150 years. at universities, we often perceive or feel this tension between kind of the open access paradigm, let it out there, maybe people will figure out if they don't know what it's going to become, what it is, sort of open access is good for diffusion. At the same time, it's pretty clear that we, sort of have systems for protecting investment through patents. Universities have gotten into that with Bayh-Dole. What advice should we give to the TLO at BU or to companies working with the patent, kind of offices of universities as we look forward, say, at AI or whatever else you'd like to speculate about?
Well, my expertise is in the 19th century, so I won't try too hard to answer the what do we do in the future question. But and to repeat for those of you who were with us this morning, some of what Chris Beecham's talk covered. The patents were, Bell's patent was extremely important. It really was constitutive. As Chris's book makes very clear, it's really, not to take anything away from what Bell did, but it's because of the patent cases and the hundreds of lawsuits that Bell fought that we even regard the telephone as a single invention with a single inventor and not as the multifarious complex system with lots of innovations the way we might think of the internet. I think the balance, but also, the story I briefly alluded to of the telephone grew fastest. Had there been no patent system, Bell would quickly have been overrun, and really Western Union would have taken over the incumbent would have crushed the upstart. But in the most innovative period, I would argue, in the early telephone, the time when the telephone went from being this tool only for the rich to being a democratic medium, the time when there was so much innovation in what the telephone could be and how it was used, the time when it became part of ordinary people's lives, was the post-patent competitive era when we had all the independent companies. So I think the balance is, especially with communication technology, it's not only a matter of the invention itself, but with both the telephone and the internet, and I venture to say AI, these are important inventions, but they are also inventions that people will use to make inventions on. They are platforms on which new innovation will happen. And with all respect to Sampath, I think that one reason net neutrality matters is that we don't want, the person who owns the network to be able to exclude not just competitors, but innovations that could be built on top of that network. At the software level or the app level above that, or so what do we do to keep our, once the idea of net neutrality is that this thing is so important to us that it is, and there's so much potential in it that it is, however nice a guy Sampath might be, we should not, in fact, leave it up to Verizon to decide which things go over the wires first or fastest or best. And so I would just say the key is to definitely reward on investment, but also to keep those systems generative and to create the next round of innovations on top of it.
Yeah, I'm going to arrive actually at a similar place. But so there is I think, 75-year empirical legacy now in economics that patents work very differently in different industries. Actually, the latest and greatest in that is written by none other than our moderator, Tim Simcoe, in the Review of Economics and Statistics. And so what works, and most of this is about how firms use patents, right? But I'll get to the universities in a second. What works in pharma and how patents work in pharma may be very different from how they work in IT, and very different still from how they work in AI. My sense is that the advice that I would give technology transfer offices, and this is, by the way, what the very good technology transfer offices already do, is recognize that there's different commercialization pathways for different kinds of inventions. Early on in the years immediately after Bayh-Dole, there was a tendency of some tech transfer offices to treat everything like it was a blockbuster drug and to try to get very, very grabby around it. And I think partly they realized that university presidents started asking, where's the money from all this stuff? And they weren't making money. Most tech transfer offices, I think, still don't break even. And I think there has been an evolution now to where I think is a good place where tech transfer offices realize that their purpose is to get technologies out there, not necessarily to make money, though making money can be a nice side effect of that. But that the pathways to do so in terms of whether you patent at all, but also if you patent, whether you license exclusively, co-exclusively, non-exclusively, that may vary by type of invention and type of field. Just one last thought related to the comments Rob made. It strikes me that a number of the questions, the policy questions around university patenting are around patent scope, especially patent scope for upstream technologies in contexts where invention is cumulative. They're actually not that different from some of the questions we were asking about the Bell patent. So in that sense, the 1876 stuff, it remains relevant today.
I guess the last piece I would add to that is even in the same industry, you have to look at the governance. And governance in the same industry might vary. And just let me give an example. You all probably have a router at home. How did that router get there? Well, it sends Wi-Fi over the spectrum. That's unlicensed spectrum. But by law, it can't use that unlicensed spectrum without clearance from the Federal Communications Commission, who's privatized the certification, by the way. So there's an engineer at a private firm somewhere who certified that that router properly works. It has a little sticker on it that says it's Wi-Fi compatible. That's a trademark. The Wi-Fi Association won't put that trademark on your box unless you join the Wi-Fi Association, and then you actually take your router and have it tested by the association. Then it says it's now Wi-Fi compatible. Then it's probably doing either video or music and sending that to your speakers or to your phone. That's using compression software. All compression software pretty much that's used on the internet today has been developed by private firms. There are patent pools that, again, our moderator knows more about this than anyone else in this room, and the patent pools have a administrative process for extracting royalties for the use of those compression software, and that's licensed out to the users who are then using the compression software. And that's all just to get you to make it easy for you to watch Netflix. Now each one of those is a different governance model, and that's the way our internet works today.
Okay, I think I've been told to wrap it up. Thank you so much to the panelists. And thank you to all of you. Thank you to the Ravi Mehrotra Institute for organizing tonight's event. Crystal, would you like the last word? Thank you to Crystal as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't want to keep you from your food and drinks, but I do want to thank again all of our incredible panelists. I want to call out two things. BU Archives has generously let us borrow for tonight only some documents that Bell has signed and written. They are downstairs in the glass case right next to the table with the phones. The phones are also here only for this evening, and they're on loan from a really lovely museum in New Hampshire. So please make sure you find those and enjoy yourselves until, if you're a student from BU, we'll need to leave at 8. The museum has told me that they may stay open a little bit later if there's some stragglers, but we're 8 o'clock is the goal for this evening. Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it. Actually, I'll put on the